welcome you all to our 2024 Allianz Risk Barometer webinar. Thank you for joining us this morning. If you don't know my name is Thusang Mahlangu. I'm the CEO of Allianz Commercial in South Africa, and I'll be your host this morning. We do have an hour and a half. The first hour will be the presentation, and the last 30 minutes of our 1.5 hours will be a Q&A. But I'm not alone in terms of this morning's webinar. I'm accompanied by my colleagues. And first up, I want to just make sure that they can see me and hear me. We'll start with Senzile and Ndlozi. Just a quick hi. Senzi is our new business development manager in Africa. Hi, Senzi. Okay, you wave. Oh, you just wave. Great start. The next up will be Geoff, who is our head of property and Midcorp. Geoff Tanton.
Morning, Thusang. Good morning, everyone.
Morning, Geoff. Welcome on board. Thirdly is Daniel Schroeder, who is our senior risk consultant. Daniel.
Good day, everyone, and good morning, Thusang.
Good morning. And last but not least, we have Kevin Barnes, our CFO. Kevin.
Hi, Thusang, and good morning, everybody.
Fantastic. I'll give it just a brief overview in terms of the top 10 global risks, including the methodology that we use in terms of conducting the survey. Number 2 to be followed by, or rather number 3 on the agenda, it will be Senzile, who will be covering the top 10 risks in Africa and Middle East. And she'll be followed by Geoff. Geoff will cover the specific business risks in South Africa. And thereafter, we will have the top 10 business risks in the rest of Africa, which is with Daniel. And then Geoff will come back and cover in more detail the top 4 business risks. And Kevin Barnes, our CFO, he will cover the bottom 5 to 10 risks. And then we should be done with the presentations. And thereafter, we'll ask you, ladies and gentlemen, to take part in the Q&A. Please use the slido.com, go through the QR code, like I mentioned, or the web browser. And it should be as easy as that. We also know that there's some people that like to use social media. So I'd like to encourage you to tag us on social media. Use the hashtag ARB2024. It's as simple as that. And we welcome you to make those comments on social media. Just if we can move the slides across to the brief methodology of the survey. We've had the survey for the past 13 years. 2024 survey, we managed to receive over 3,069 respondents in 92 countries, 24 different industry sectors. So we basically want to know what keeps our risk managers awake at night, what worries them. And we don't only interview risk managers, but also extend our survey to brokers, we extend it to industry, trade organizations, and also some of our internal experts, such as our risk consultants within the Allianz Group, of which we have over 250. Now, to give the overview of the top 10 global risks in 2024, what we've done, we've prepared a video. So drum rolls, and there we go. there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. These are our top 10 global business risks for 2024. And now I'm going to be handing over to Senzile to cover the top 10 risks in Africa and Middle East. And after that, meet you at the end during the Q&A. And over to you, Senzile.
Thank you, Thusang. A cyber event is the top business risk in both Africa and the Middle East for 2024, with 33% of the respondents naming cyber incidences as the most important business risk. Cyber incidents is ranked number 1 in over 17 countries and regions, including Germany, India, the UK, and the USA. A data breach is seen as the most concerning cyber threat, followed by attacks on critical infrastructure and physical assets. In the past 2 years, insurers have also experienced an increasing number of ransomware attacks. We've seen the number go up by 50% in 2023 when compared to 2022. This trend essentially highlights the need for companies to prioritize cyber security measures within their organizations. At number 2, we've got business interruption, which has moved up 1 place and is now the second biggest threat in Africa and the Middle East. Now, despite the easing of the post-pandemic supply chain disruptions, this peril reflects just how interconnected and volatile the global business environment is. And there is also a strong reliance on supply chains for critical goods and services. Basically, there's a growing vulnerability within businesses, and there's a need for healthy business contingency plans. At number 3, we've got the macroeconomic developments, which previously held the number 1 position in 2023. This shift signifies the changing economic landscape in the African continent as well as the Middle East. At number 4, we've got critical infrastructure blackouts or failures. In 2023, this risk was sitting at number 8, and it's up 4 places in 2024. We will delve a little bit more deeper into critical infrastructure in subsequent slides. At number 5, we've got changes in legislation and regulation, which remains unchanged. Number 6, we have natural catastrophe, which is a new entrant into the Allianz Risk Barometer for the Africa and the Middle East. In 2023, it was a record-breaking year on so many fronts. Globally, it was the hottest year since the record began. And number 2, insured losses exceeded $100 billion for the 4th consecutive year, driven by the highest ever damage bill of $60 billion from just severe thunderstorms. Last but not least, South Africa and Morocco experienced a surge in natural catastrophes. At number 7, we've got political risk and violence, which has moved down despite the ongoing conflicts in the Middle East, the Ukraine crisis, and tensions between China and the US. It does, however, rank in the top 5 for countries like Morocco and the Ivory Coast. What's also interesting about 2024 is that it is considered a super election year, where we have more than 50% of the world's population could be going into polls. This includes countries like Ghana, Mauritius, Senegal, South Africa, India, Russia, the US, and the UK. At number 8, we've got the energy crisis, which remains unchanged, sitting at number 8, but is now joined by theft, fraud, and corruption. At number 10, climate change has dropped down from being at number 4 to number 10. However, it still remains a top 5 within a number of African countries like Ghana, Mauritius, Morocco, and Nigeria. Up next is our head of property and mid-corp, Mr. Geoff Tanton, who's going to take us through the top 10 business risks for specifically South Africa. Thank you.
Thanks, Senzile. So as we turn our focus to the risk landscape for South Africa, we notice that it's slightly different to the rest of the world, and there's no surprise for that. It's the critical infrastructure failure and blackouts tops our list in 2024. And it's certainly not surprising, given that we suffered an unprecedented 332 days of load shedding during 2023. The ongoing load shedding is foremost in the minds of most business owners in South Africa and the public as a whole. And the reaction to President Ramaphosa's recent SONA speech is evidence of the frustration of the South African public in the inability of Eskom to deal with our aging energy infrastructure. Load shedding has brought about new risks to bear, including the potential for fires and explosions caused by extended use of generators and sources of backup power where these machines are running for longer periods of time than intended and are not able to be maintained and serviced. An additional knock-on effect of load shedding is to our water infrastructure, and there are fears that water shedding may become the next infrastructure issue that we would need to address. And from an insurance risk perspective, the lack of electricity heightens the risk to fire protections, not operating, increasing the exposure to losses, and companies are encouraged to build their resilience by investing in off-the-grid electricity systems and backup water supplies in the form of water tanks and booster pumps to be less reliant on municipalities in dealing with these exposures. Secondly, we have cyber incidents, and Sen's covered a large amount of that. As she rightly said, it is the #1 threat worldwide, second to South Africa, and across a wide range of industries, including consumer goods, financial services, government, public services, healthcare, leisure and tourism, and the list goes on. Cyber threats are constantly evolving as hackers and criminals gain access to new technologies, finding new ways to exploit old vulnerabilities. Hackers are beginning to use artificial intelligence-powered language models to increase the speed and the scope of ransomware attacks, as well as create new malware and produce highly convincing phishing emails and deepfakes. Such attacks are likely to proliferate further and deeper into 2024. Third, we've got business interruption, including supply chain disruption. And with almost all companies reliant on supply chains for critical products and services, it's no surprising that this sits as #3 for South Africa. Business interruption caused by supply chain disruption remains at the forefront of business risk. Some sectors of industry operate with supply chains that have extensive geographic footprints, and losses abroad can have major impacts on local businesses due to stock shortages or the inability to supply key plant and machinery for business operations. And next, we have natural catastrophes at #4. And it's no surprise that natural catastrophes has risen back from #6 previously. I think it was #9 previously, now up to #4. As can be seen by the widespread floods that we experienced in Durban in 2022 that cost the South African industry a massive amount in loss of life and as well as loss of assets, that then continued into 2023 with the severe floods that we saw and windstorms we saw in the Western Cape, and then again at the end of 2023 with more local flooding happening within Durban and the KZN coastline. This is just evidence of how the changing weather patterns, which I'll get to in another slide or area, that we are seeing happen more and more due to the changing weather patterns and climate change. Next, we have the energy crisis, which I've already addressed really under critical infrastructure blackouts, and it really is interlinked in a lot of ways. The reality is the continuing price increases for electricity and the inefficiency of supply just exacerbates this issue. Next, we have political risk and violence. The defining moment for 2023 was the Hamas attack on Israel and the subsequent war in Gaza. And this has led not only to thousands of innocent deaths in Gaza, but also to increased pro-Palestinian and pro-Israeli protests globally. And amidst all of this conflict, as Senzile pointed out, we have more than 50% of the world going to the polls this year, South Africa included. And so many elections raise concerns about the fueling of populism and polarization, which may manifest in increasing civil unrest activity. The riots and civil unrest in July 2021 are a solemn reminder of one of the most costly and devastating incidents in recent memory for South Africa. Next, we have climate change, as I previously mentioned, and the increase in the frequency and severity of extreme weather events have ensured climate change remains a top fixture on corporate risk engineers' minds. The risk is threefold: physical, including the loss of damage to assets and business interruption; transition-related, from the move towards a more sustainable economy and regulatory and stakeholder pressures; and financially liability related, from climate litigation that could lead to reputational and financial damage. We see companies shifting to low carbon business models, improving planning and response to climate events, and implementing physical measures to boost resilience. Next up, we have fire and explosion, which is unaltered at #8 for South Africa. And although fire risks are well understood and typically well managed, fire remains a significant cause of business interruption and supply chain disruption, especially where critical components are concentrated geographically and amongst a small number of key suppliers. It generally also takes longer to recover from a fire than from any other peril, which includes the additional risk of losing clientele for companies through business interruption. In South Africa, we have the added risk of the aging infrastructure, which means that municipal resources in the form of water supply and fire services are ineffective and exacerbates the exposure and the severity of potential fire and explosion damage. Regular assessment and updating of fire mitigating practices, including preventative measures, fire extinguishing methods, water and booster pumps, internally trained fire teams, and off-the-grid water and electricity solutions are becoming more and more important to South African businesses. With the introduction of solar energy to the masses, there is an elevated risk now for the use and storage of lithium-ion batteries, which has been the result of a number of fire risks, both on land and on sea, in the recent years. And next we have theft, fraud, and corruption, which for me is very interesting because it's never been within, or maybe in the past, one of the top risks for South Africa, but it has now crept up into number 9 for 2024. And I suppose it's no surprise, given the systemic socioeconomic issues that we have in South Africa relating to fraud and corruption. Opportunism relating to failing infrastructure and desperation due to the socioeconomic climate are all factors which are exacerbating the issue. Cash and transit heists have increased exponentially as well-organized syndicates target specific businesses and industries to maximize their impact. It's also critical for businesses to focus on good corporate governance and to ensure that fraud and corruption are not tolerated. Investing in good security protocols and equipment can mitigate such exposures. And finally, we have changes in legislation and regulation. South African companies should be no stranger to the high cost and administrative burden of ongoing changes to legislation and regulation, especially within the financial industry. But it is an additional pressure for environmental, social, and governance requirements that have risen to the fore recently. Companies are having to put strategies in place to address their impact on the environment, to reduce emissions, and to aim for a zero net effect in the coming years. This will impact the cost and availability of insurance, especially in those companies and countries that are either unable or unwilling to change to renewable energy sources. That's it from my side. I'm going to hand over to Daniel, who's going to take us to the next slide.
Right, thanks, Geoff, and hello to all who have joined us on the call today. As mentioned by Geoff, I will be covering the non-participating African countries in the 2024 edition of the Allianz Risk Barometer. These are namely Nigeria, Mauritius, Cameroon, Uganda, Ivory Coast, Kenya, Ghana, Senegal, and Morocco. For the various countries, I will not go through the top 10 each time as there are too many common risks as well as common causes. I will therefore rather focus on the unique and noteworthy areas and the differences. But first, let me cover some important elements that will affect all of these African countries. Due to Africa having some unique challenges, we would expect the risk barometer to reflect this, and it does not disappoint. The responses from the participating African countries in the 2024 edition offer up some interesting findings. 2024 will also see 2024 will see many elections being held, with Ghana and Senegal being amongst these. This would offer an explanation as to why governance-related risks feature regularly for these 9 countries. While cybersecurity features on most of these lists, it is not as dominant as within other regions of the world. Elements such as inflation, fire, market developments, and changes in legislation appear to be on average a higher concern. Natural catastrophes has been the biggest faller for these 9 countries, falling down the list or completely off of them. It only features on 3 of these 9 countries. Africa as a whole, as we know, is not prone to many of these natural catastrophes experienced in the rest of the world. However, events such as wildfire, earthquakes, and tornadoes, as an example. The worst type of natural catastrophe we do need to note in Africa would be the likes of droughts and floods. We are seeing an increase in Africa and globally in flood events specifically, and also specifically in areas that weren't prone to these events in previous history. Thus, a lot of due diligence needs to be done when going through the risk assessments when focusing on floods. Energy security and power disruptions remain an ongoing challenge across Africa. However, you will see this does not feature as much as expected. This may be that in Africa we've become more resilient in dealing with this, or it is felt that other risks currently have a higher risk threat to us at the moment. So as we look at Nigeria in front of you, the report highlights changes in legislation, cyber incidents, and macroeconomic developments being the joint top with 36%. The macroeconomic fears are backed up by the rising inflation in Nigeria, which reached roughly around 29% in December. The changing regulatory environment poses significant challenges for businesses in Nigeria, and it's critical for companies to stay updated and ensure compliance to mitigate potential risks. It is interesting that the challenges with energy security, specifically in Nigeria, is not mentioned on the list, only featuring, or not featuring highly on the list. It's at number 8 and it was 7th in 2023. Moving to Mauritius. Mauritius does offer some interesting challenges, being an island separated from the main coastal land. While it is a strategic location between Africa and Asia, it depends heavily on food and energy imports, which create potential disruptions for Mauritius, and they can also experience severe windstorms and tropical storms. However, despite this, business interruption has fallen out of the top 10 for the first time. However, it is very important to note that this will always be a challenge for a country that is that heavily dependent on imports. Shortage of skilled workforce has fallen a few places on this list. However, it will remain a concern, with Mauritius having one of the highest perceived labor shortages in the world. Then moving on to look at Cameroon. Cameroon is the only African country that does not feature cyber incidents in the top 10. This certainly does not mean that cyber is not a risk within Cameroon. However, the respondents currently interpret other risks as higher priorities. Cameroon does see natural catastrophes as a new entrant at number 5. This is likely due to a number of notable floods in recent years, such as the flood in Yaoundé in October 2023. Business interruption has fallen from 1st to 10th from 2023 to the 24 edition. Again, we see a trend of business interruption falling out of favor slightly, not completely off of the list, but it does seem to be dropping down the priority list of current risks. Then we move to look at Uganda. Cyber incidents are at number 1 in Uganda, with a staggering 48% of respondents expressing concern. So Uganda does show this as an outlier. So most African countries do feature cyber. However, this is the most dominant. We've seen it on any of these 9 countries. Market developments, theft, fraud, and corruption were identified as the joint second risks. Critical infrastructure is at number 7 on this list. Uganda's had a number of nationwide blackouts in recent years, and this is a risk facing several African countries as well as South Africa. An important thing we can conclude from this version of the Allianz Risk Barometer is that each region of the world has some unique challenges. However, we are not alone in any of these risks that we are facing. So we need to ensure that as best we can, we learn and we share knowledge to ensure that we overcome them together and as fast as possible. Then looking at the Ivory Coast results. Ivory Coast is a new entrant on the list, jumping to number 1, political risks and violence. This is likely impacted by Ivory Coast President Alassane removing the Prime Minister and dissolving his government in late 2023, and the uncertainty created by these actions. Ivory Coast will have its next elections in 2025, and it is likely that these risks will remain a concern until then. As mentioned previously, 2024 is going to be a record-breaking year in terms of voting around the world. So it is not a surprise that this will be something that a lot of people will be watching closely, because this will affect all of these 9 countries as well as many third world countries around the world that are heavily dependent on first world elections. Kenya. Kenya shows some interesting feedback where cyber incidents such as ransomware, data breaches, and IT disruptions were highly expressed by the participants. The closely interlinked peril of business interruption was partnered with it at number 5. And fire and explosion, interestingly, features for the first time in Kenya. A note on Kenya is that it experiences droughts once every 10 years, with the largest flood in 2018. Even though natural catastrophes was an interesting omission from the top 10 list you see in front of you, it is a risk we all need to keep in mind, and I just wanted to highlight. Ghana. Ghana shows some very interesting feedback. Macroeconomic developments once again takes the center stage as the most concerning business risk. This is no surprise due to Ghana's current economic challenges, which has resulted in the government request for a $3 billion bailout, which is roughly around $9 a person based on their current population data. And this was requested from the International Monetary Fund last year. Ghana also faced an inflation rate of 42% in 2023, following an inflation of 31.9% in 2022, and is forecasted to be 23% in 2024. No doubt these are challenging financial times for them. And again, as businesses, as partners of these businesses, we need to ensure that we are cognizant of this risk and that we support them correctly. Following closely in second place is fire and explosion, up from fourth place last year, and market developments rounds off the list in third place. Natural catastrophes appears for the first time on this list at number 10. It's expected that this may rise up the list in future surveys, as Ghana has had some flooding events recently. It was quite well publicized, the irrigation dam spillage in 2023, as well as the releasing of water from 2 hydro dams in last year as well. This is also starting to become a noteworthy element that we as a risk community need to consider, where you need to protect your dam from overflowing, and thus you have to release large volumes of water. This can be mismanaged at times, or the communication may not be as clear, and thus you may find that you need to be looking at your projects to ensure that they are not downstream of a significant water body that either could have a failure or they need to protect it and release large volumes of water. All right. Then finally, looking at Morocco. Morocco is the biggest mover is natural catastrophes. This no doubt would be linked to the September 23 earthquakes that they suffered. And this also follows earthquakes in Morocco in 2019 and 2016. And there were also severe floods in Morocco in 2023 as well. So natural catastrophe no doubt will be something that needs to be carefully considered in Morocco. And changes in legislation and cyber round out the top 3 is 1 and 2. All right. That's all from me on the African countries. I would now like to hand back to Geoff to discuss the top 4 business risks in 2024 in more detail. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Daniel. So now we're going to be shifting our attention away from South Africa and to the top 4 global risks, business risks in 2024. And the first one we're going to deep dive into is cyber. Cyber was the top global risk and the second in the South African market, but we see that it ranks at number 1 across the Americas, Africa, Middle East, Asia Pacific, Europe, and across all company sizes, which includes large 500 mil euro in excess, mid-sized 250 to 500 mil, and then small companies, which is below that. Cyber is the cause of business interruption that companies fear the most, while cybersecurity resilience is their most concerning ESG issue. Businesses and the wider economy are now more reliant on digital services and infrastructure for both critical and everyday activities. Almost everything is now linked to technology. But with that always-on connectivity, this opens the door to hackers to steal data, to threaten disruption for extortion. The uptake for cyber insurance in South Africa, if we bring it back to South Africa, has been relatively low, with companies not fully understanding the impact until it's too late. And then the impact is devastating. Mobile devices, exposed data lack security, and the mixing of personal and corporate data on mobile devices, including smartphones, tablets, and laptops, is an attractive combination for cyber criminals. Allianz Commercial has seen a number of incidents growing caused by poor cybersecurity around mobile devices. During the pandemic, many organizations enabled new ways of accessing their corporate network via private devices without the need for multi-factor authentication, or we refer to as MFA. And this has also resulted in a number of successful cyber attacks and large insurance claims. Data breach, I think Senzile mentioned this, is the cyber exposure of the most concern, followed by cyber attacks on critical infrastructure and physical assets, and an increase in ransomware attacks. Companies should look to enhancing their cybersecurity by investing in phishing, malware, and antivirus software, as well as encryption software to protect themselves. As we move on to business interruption, which was number 2 of the business risks worldwide and number 1 across 9 countries, COVID-19 and the resultant disruption to supply chains has been a wake-up call for businesses, and it is critical that local businesses looked to create alternative supply networks to build resilience to withstand potential supply disruption following a loss event. By de-risking supply chains, what follows is an increase in business continuity and resilience and a reduction in supply chain bottlenecks. However, smaller companies are more exposed in this regard as they do not have the financial resources always to invest in supply chain diversification. And this remains a challenge for a number of local SME and mid-sized companies. Cyber incidents and natural catastrophes are the top two causes of business interruption, followed by fire and machinery equipment breakdown or failure. The recent disruption in the Red Sea, a vital trade route between Europe and Asia due to the Houthi rebel attacks on vessels, is the latest risk to hit supply chains. More than 400 container ships were diverted via the Cape of Good Hope around the southern tip of Africa between December and mid-January, causing delays to deliveries of products. As we move to the next one, which is natural catastrophes, I've already gone into a relative amount of detail here, but let me just highlight some other things. Natural catastrophes has risen back to the third position in top business risks worldwide and as the #1 across 9 countries, which include Morocco. The cost of the global insurance industry last year exceeded $100 billion for the 4th consecutive year, and it is the primary driver of the increased cost of treaty reinsurance in the market. The devastating effect of El Nino on changing currents and weather patterns, as well as global warming, is having an adverse effect and causing an increase in both severity and frequency of these losses, which has resulted in the insurance industry looking to mitigate this exposure by introducing loss limits for flood and windstorm exposures, as well as higher deductible attachment points to ensure sustainability of insurance in the future. Businesses should look to implement flood protection in minimizing potential exposures in the future to mitigate losses, as well as considering their location to potentially close to river and flood lines, as it is clear that these events will continue to occur more frequently in the future, and companies need to build risk evaluation and resilience into their risk programs going forward. And finally, we'll end with changes in legislation and regulation. This was ranked at #4 worldwide and #1 in 4 countries, including Morocco. The increased regulation landscape brings included, as I mentioned, increased administrative burden on businesses, and it detracts from the core focus of the business. Since the pandemic, policymakers have increasingly taken an active stance in steering economic outcomes in the direction that they want. The reasons for this can also be found in the energy crisis or the green transformation, in national security, economic self-sufficiency, or systemic competition. As so often is the case, the regulations have an asymmetrical effect. While large companies tend to benefit from the subsidies, it's the investment restrictions that are the heavy burden and the cost for smaller and mid-sized companies. The human factor in the ESG, or the social factor, is perhaps the hardest for organizations to contend with because it requires a broad focus on people, the workplace, and society as a whole. Company working conditions in an ESG issue is an ESG issue because, if bad, it can result in low morale, increased staff turnover, and reputational damage to the company in itself. Thanks. I'm going to be handing over to Kevin, our Chief Financial Officer, who's going to be taking us through the next 5 to 10 business risks in 2024. Thanks, Kevin.
Thanks, Geoff, and welcome everybody from my side. I'm going to take you through the balance of the top 6 on the global risks, and as far as possible, align that to Africa where possible. So number 5 on the risk, as you can see on the screen, is macroeconomic developments. It was number 3 in 2023 and has dropped to number 5. I think of the old adage that when the Western world sneezes, Africa catches a cold, and I'm afraid that still holds true. So from an African perspective, we still need to take our lead from the Americas, Europe, and the growing East. Allianz Research expects in 2024 that growth in major economies will be below 1%. With 5% in China looking good, but with a global growth rate of just 2%. What does this mean? This consolidation is expected to pivot the global economies to a more usual level that we would have expected pre-COVID, and a good base to continue on going forward. But I'm afraid there is bad news. Insolvencies usually lag economic growth, And Allianz Trade expects global insolvencies to rise by 8% in 2024, making trade credit insurance still critical as a risk management tool. Number 6 is fire and explosion. It was number 9 globally last year and has moved up to number 6. As has been mentioned previously in the presentation, fire and explosion is always a significant part of business interruption, and this has been increased by electrification, the use of solar panels, as well as conserving energy in lithium-ion batteries, which has been mentioned before. So from a risk management point of view, it is critical to regularly assess and update fire mitigation, including preventative measures, is essential for lowering this risk. Globally, the number 7 risk is climate change. This has stayed flat from the prior Allianz Risk Barometer. Although there is a lot of debate about the reasons for climate change, there can be no doubt that there is a change. And one of the things that we need to focus on, there's been a number of reasons mentioned in the presentation previously, but flooding and drought needs to be considered in choosing locations for businesses going forward. As Daniel mentioned, below big water masses, etc., it becomes critical going forward when you're starting new operations. Number 8 on the list is political risks and violence. It was number 10 previously and has moved down to number 8. Senzile mentioned this in great detail about this mega voting year around the world. But what this means is that it fuels populism, it polarizes communities, and this manifests into an increased risk of civil unrest and needs to be a risk that's prepared for by the risk management community. Number 9 is a new risk, a new global risk on the Allianz Risk Barometer. It comes in at number 9, and there are 3 main paradigm shifts that have been identified by Allianz that drive this market development. The first is the end of globalization and an increase in national protectionism. Now, historically, this used to be the movement of goods, but this has escalated now to capital flows, restriction in investments, as well as protection of information and data, which is an uptick in market development. The second paradigm shift is the end of so-called cheap labor in traditional Western economies, and I'll touch on that on the 10th risk as well. The last paradigm shift, the third one, is the end of what we call innocent technologies. The warnings about the possible negative consequences of technologies like artificial intelligence is getting louder and louder and needs to be considered as part of our risk management strategy. Now, I alluded to number 10 a bit earlier. Number 10 on the global risk is the shortage of the skilled workforce. Now, this is traditionally a risk in an economy or a country with a very low unemployment rate. The flip side in Africa is that if we have economies with a high unemployment rate, that gives us the opportunity to drive our GDP by upskilling our population and providing that shortage to the other economies. So we need to focus on the plus side of number 10 in economies that have a very high unemployment rate. So that's the top 10 globally. Thank you for listening to us.